Dr. Rebecca Deen, Professor of Political Science at UT Arlington. Thank you so much. As always, we appreciate it. So here we are, and the presidential race, at least on the Republican side, is heating up. It's getting interesting. Former Vice President Mike Pence is jumping into the race this week, and former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie is jumping into the race. And so what do you make of this, and how will this impact the growing Republican field?
Well, it's very interesting. And I think the first thing that it indicates is that, excuse me, although former President Trump is polling the best among all of these either announced candidates or potential candidates, there's dissatisfaction among the GOP electorate, and certainly within those who might want to put their hat into the ring. It is interesting that a former president is garnering so many opponents.
And why do you think that is? I mean, you talked a little bit about the dissatisfaction. What's the dissatisfaction over in your estimation?
Well, we've always known that he had a hard ceiling. He won the GOP nomination in 2016, largely because of the crowded field. He was able to move his way through that season in a way that knocked down his opponents. And there were so many of them that mathematically it was easier for him to move through that process. And then, of course, his actions in office were not universally applauded. Certainly, he engendered quite a bit of dissatisfaction among independents and certainly among Democrats. And then we can't overlook his scandals and the investigations that he's under and potential indictments to come down. So I think there's a myriad of things from both his historic polling numbers as well as the events post-presidency. And then, of course, we can't overlook January 6th. So I think there's just a number of things that pull down his favorability ratings.
And I want to get into all those things that you mentioned a little bit, but I wanted to ask you about Texas. And, obviously you cannot win the White House without winning Texas. And you have two candidates fundraising in North Texas this week, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis and former governor and secretary of the UN under President Trump, Nikki Haley. And so what do you make of the fact that they're coming to Texas doing fundraising trips? Nikki Haley's holding a news conference in West Texas, but not Governor DeSantis.
Well, I think each of them is motivated by a variety of things unique to their campaign. First of all, Texas has deep pockets. And so their viable candidates are going to make swings through here for fundraising. Not only for garnering the actual money, the actual funds, but also to increase their cachet among that donor elite. So the fact that they're coming through doesn't surprise me. Also, both of those two candidates have been a part of smaller meetings with groups that whose influence is significant. For example, both of them, as well as former Vice President Pence, were part of a meeting back in the spring with the Club for Growth, who did not invite former President Trump to that meeting. So those sorts of things indicate that they are real contenders. Now, certainly Governor DeSantis has the strongest polling numbers of those who would challenge former President Trump. But even Secretary Haley, former Governor Haley, has attracted interest among the GOP. So it doesn't surprise me that they're attracting fundraising. It doesn't surprise me that they're coming to North Texas. Now, what is interesting, I think, is that former Governor Haley is going to West Texas. That tells me that she's trying to solidify her bona fides among the most conservative in the GOP electorate. She really had kind of been running, at least initially, folks tended to see her in social conservatism, but with real foreign policy chops. And so this tells me that she's trying to shore up some of that support. She's not as inherently confrontational as Governor DeSantis. And so I think, each of these, we use this analogy a lot, right? When there's a crowded field, we talk about lanes. And so each of them is trying to figure out what his or her lane is going to be in this election.
And let me ask you, because, there's a new poll out today in Texas, and it shows, Trump way ahead of everybody, which mirrors the national polls, as you mentioned before. And so I'm wondering, I mean, aren't all these polls really premature until we have the first debate? Because everybody's going to want to know, how does DeSantis react to Trump when Trump goes after him, if Trump takes part in this debate? But I always say, well, why wouldn't he want to take part of it? Because that's where all the attention is going to be. So what do you make of all that?
Yeah, I think you're right. Absolutely, that it's very early. I mean, I heard it described as late early. So it would be pretty unrealistic for someone who, we hadn't even had on our radar to jump into the field now, right? So it's late in that sense, but there's a lot of ground between now and even when the first contest is held, beginning of next calendar year. So you're right, it's too soon to take any one poll terribly seriously, but trend lines I think are telling, and so it is telling that President Trump, former President Trump, has this clear advantage. But as you allude to here, a lot of it's got to be name recognition. So I think that as we hear from these candidates more, and as the debate, I think the GOP has set that debate in August. As that happens, we'll learn more. Now, what's interesting about the actual debate itself is the Republican National Committee has three guiding principles for whether folks can even show up on the stage. One is polling, one is fundraising, not only in hard dollar amounts, but also breadth of support. And the other is that they have to sign a pledge that they will support whoever the nominee is. And it's that last piece that's gotten a lot of attention. So, we'll see who's eligible for the debate when August rolls around. Now, as to whether or not former President Trump chooses to participate, I mean, goodness gracious, your guess is as good as mine. I mean, on the one hand, I think that, as you say, why not? On the other hand, front runners, traditional front runners, which I don't think we would call former President Trump traditional in most ways, but traditional front runners don't want to do things that could run them into trouble, right? They're risk averse because they're trying to protect a lead. Will former President Trump behave that way? I don't know. He does want to be where the attention is. On the other hand, all the arrows will be aimed at him.
And how do candidates, because one thing that we hear when you talk to Republicans, they like for the former president's policies. They could do without the tweets, et cetera. And so how does another candidate go after the president and try to, attract voters? How do they do that? Because, I've heard that, they don't want to be disrespectful to a former president in the office, but at the same time, attract people and make themselves more viable.
Well, that's really interesting. And I think that's where you see some of the differences, certainly in style and approach among these candidates. So you've got Senator Jim Scott from South Carolina, another South Carolinian who is trying to echo sort of a Ronald Reagan happy warrior type, certainly very conservative, certainly had voted in line with President Trump during that administration. Then you have former Vice President Pence, who's trying to be, the elder statesman here. And then you have Governor DeSantis, who's trying to be like President Trump in style, but even more to the right of him. He's going after him as not being conservative enough on things like abortion and the COVID restrictions. So it is really interesting to see how each of these candidates are trying to um, attract his supporters, former President Trump's supporters on policy, and then to differentiate themselves in terms of the kind of president that he or she would be.
You mentioned before the fact that there are a lot of investigations into former President Trump, relates to January 6th, relates to presidential records, the Georgia investigation about interfering in their election in 2020, and also in New York State. And so I'm wondering what impact, if he is to be indicted, would that have on the race and on his candidacy?
I think it depends on which one of those hits. All right. So you had a conviction on a civil case for sexual misconduct and abuse. And I think that many voters, while they might view that as abhorrent, that's sort of a known to them, right? If they were a Trump supporter, then that was something that wasn't going to be disqualifying, that sort of behavior. Um, I think that election interference perhaps is in a separate category. So it will depend on which of those investigations would land with an indictment. I think it does matter if it's a federal indictment versus a state indictment. I think it's, even though the federal indictment, former President Trump could cast that as, Biden administration Democrats going after him. I do think perhaps voters might weigh a federal indictment differently than they would a state or a city indictment.
And so that could potentially harm him, depending on what the charge is, et cetera.
Yeah, depending on what the charge is, depending on when it lands also. And former President Trump is really adept at being able to not have things that would have torpedoed an ordinary politician seem to pierce the armor.
And you talked before about the loyal people who are very loyal to former President Trump. And what would it take in your mind for people to say, all right, we just need to cut the cord and move forward and back somebody else?
I don't know the answer to that, Jack. I think that there's a core there who have been with him through thick and thin and continue to be with him. I think those who have peeled away already have peeled away, and I've seen some of that support go to Governor DeSantis, and some of it is sort of a wait and see, right? I think there's a lot of potential in the polling numbers for movement. So I certainly wouldn't want to make a prediction today that would be set in stone, but there is a core that just stays with him.
And to your point, as far as some of the Republicans who we've heard from say, this shows all of all these investigations are politically motivated to try to sideline him, try to get him out of the picture. And his supporters say, this makes us support him even more. What do you make of that?
Well, it makes sense. I mean, so if you think about the way that individuals form opinions and have those opinions reinforced, if you are committed to your position, people trying to dissuade you of that opinion only reinforces your opinion more. So I don't find that trend to be particularly surprising.
Dr. Rebecca Deen from UT Arlington, thank you so much. We really appreciate your insight as always.
It's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you.